This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com, and I have with me this morning a couple of noted experts and well-recognized financial and geopolitical writers. No stranger to our regular listeners is John Rubino, well-known author and publisher of the website dollarcollapse.com. But also joining us today is F. William Engdahl from Frankfurt. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Morning, Gord.
William may not be as familiar to all of our listeners, being the first time we've had him on the show. I was wondering, William, if you could give our listeners a perspective of your background and some of your writings.
I've been writing about the themes I write about for some 37, 38 years now. Originally in New York as a freelance journalist during the oil crises of the 70s. I began looking at energy in a detailed way and the way that the global oil markets work, especially the Anglo-American oil markets. That led to the first book I wrote called A Century of War, Anglo-American Oil Politics and the New World Order, which goes from the dawn of the age of oil right up through the Iraq War and beyond that to the present. My background is as an economist. I look at geopolitics, however. I don't look at economics in terms of microeconomics. I try to look at the broad historical trends. I suppose, if anything, I would call myself a student of the German historical school of economics around Friedrich List and Pechheim Smith in America back around the same time, around the time of Lincoln and shortly before. But the idea of looking at economics as a real process in the real world in real time, what the major trends are, who the powers are, or what the powers are that are defining economic reality or depression, boom or bust. And from that standpoint, look at the political economy, the interface between politics and economics, which I call geopolitics because it's influenced enormously by geography.
John and I asked William to join us this morning because we've done many shows from a financial and markets perspective about the U.S. dollar reserve currency status, the petrodollar, cyber threats, erosion of constitutional liberties, and the growing role of statism in central planning. But we thought we needed to put these into a context of the bigger picture that is at play. And that bigger picture is the geopolitical strategy going on that we only see through distorted and spun glimpses which the Western media tells us about regarding the Arab Spring, currently Egypt and Syria, Georgia and Yemen. Conflicts, frankly, seem to be appearing just absolutely everywhere. And there's no one who understands better how these are all linked and what is really going on between the major global powers than William, frankly, in all of his writings that he's been doing for quite a length of time. I'm going to jump right in here and ask you, and it comes from one of your recent books, Full Spectrum Dominance, but if you could define what full spectrum dominance is and what you mean by the New World Order and specifically the totalitarian democracy within it.
Well, the term is a Pentagonese term. It was a document published some years ago around the time of the Iraqi invasion, in 2003 thereabouts, and the Pentagon defined full spectrum dominance as the objective, quote unquote, and that is domination by the U.S. Armed Forces of land, of the oceans, of air, of space, of outer space, and cyberspace. In other words, total control everywhere. And that has been the agenda of the Pentagon and the U.S. military-industrial complex, of Washington in general, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ironically, there would be a time in history where we had a golden opportunity to turn the plows or swords into plowshares, and we did the opposite. We've been turning the plowshares into swords. NATO has extended right up to the doorstep of Russia. in the last 22 years. Missile defense, which is an extremely dangerously offensive nuclear strategy, first strike strategy, has been brought to the Poland and the Czech Republic and Turkey, all aimed at Russia, not aimed at Iran. And now it's being brought into Japan and into the Pacific for the China pivot, which Obama calls euphemistically the Asia pivot. So the goal of the military-industrial complex, whose control point is in the Pentagon, is this total global control. Now, when I use the title "Totalitarian Democracy in the New World Order," Papa Bush made a speech to Congress at the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And he was jubilant. He was euphoric. He said, "We've won," to his friends and all biographical accounts of his state of mind. And he talked about creating a new world order to the Congress of the United States, that America is the sole superpower of this new world order. And it doesn't take a great leap of the imagination. It certainly is no theoretical conspiracy or conspiracy theory. It's a strange term, I find, to imagine that the idea of this global domination that the Pentagon calls full spectrum dominance is a totalitarian democracy, because it is not about freedoms. Look at what's happened in the U.S. since 9/11 with the Patriots Act, so-called, against the Patriot Act, I would call it, and various restrictions on the basic civil liberties of the Bill of Rights of the American Constitution. We virtually have allowed our Constitution to be ripped into shreds first by George W. Bush and Cheney, and now by Obama and company there, and by the Supreme Court. So this totalitarian democracy is a deliberate putting together of two completely seemingly contrary terms, democracy and totalitarianism, but that in fact is what it is. Under the banner of democracy, the Pentagon has a regime change module that they put in place, developed over decades by the RAND Corporation and various Pentagon-linked think tanks, to put into place pro-NATO, pro-US satrap regimes in Georgia, in Ukraine, wherever in the world they can possibly do it. And they thought they had it done in Egypt with Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, but that seems to be backfiring on them at the moment. So that's what I mean by totalitarian democracy in the New World Order. It's not a world order that I'm certainly looking forward to.
You mentioned the missiles that are placed, or discussions part of NATO, trying to move them into some of the East Bloc countries. The impression in the West and Western media is that's to contain issues in Iran specifically. And then, of course, Obama's recent Pacific pivot, which you also mentioned, but is aimed more at Korea. And what you're saying, no, it's really about total containment of the Russian-Chinese economies.
I think the mainstream media and the White House want to make sure that that's not the perception, but that is in fact the reality. I was in Beijing having a private seminar, was invited to give a private seminar on the geopolitical landscape today to a high-level group of Chinese think tank strategists, geostrategists, and I outlined this, and they have no illusions whatsoever that the so-called Asia pivot has nothing to do with North Korea. It has to do with China. China is the big elephant in the porcelain shop.
We see that really playing out, in these issues that with oil through the Straits of Malacca. We see in former Burma the access routes for oil that doesn't take them through some of the natural blocks playing out. And you've talked about, the color revolutions, I think the saffron revolution, are being driven by the United States in this competitive tug of war.
Yeah. Well, if you look at where for China's economic development, and this is no secret, it's a fact that's been known for 15 years, since the early 90s, when China tilted over from being an oil exporter to becoming a net importer of oil, China is now today the number 2 and very close to being the number 1 import country for oil worldwide, because of the size of their economy and the requirements of that economy to continue growing. So despite the recent slowdown in some aspects of the Chinese economy, overall China's economic growth must be fueled by oil and gas. And what China has done in an almost breathtaking way over the past 10 years is literally scour the earth, either trying to buy oil companies like Unocal, which the U.S. Administration stepped in and made sure it wouldn't happen. Chevron ended up grabbing it.
Is that not the company that Karzai was actually belonged to?
Yes, Unocal. Karzai was a consultant to Unocal, as was Khalilzad, the ambassador of Bush to Afghanistan and to Iraq.
There's just way too many coincidences when you start going through the details. But somehow, that right, John, never meet the public press here in the West.
Yeah, we don't see much of this. William, one other thing that China and Russia are doing is buying a lot of gold right now.
Yes.
What part does that play in their strategy?
Well, I think long term, there, as you know, I'm sure, John, the central bank gold reserves of both China and Russia are, in comparison with Germany and other countries, European countries, Switzerland as a portion of their reserves is extremely low. So their strategy for several years now, especially since the 2007-2008 dollar crisis erupted and became a global crisis, has been to accumulate gold. And when gold, when there are manipulations by the Fed and J.P. Morgan Chase and others on the gold markets to drive the price down when it starts to get too much ahead of steam, like it was in April of this year, with naked shorts and whatnot, the Chinese wait until the bottom appears and then they start buying it at a cheaper price and keep accumulating. So I think that's the long-term strategy of both Russia and China. I think ultimately China would like to be an alternative reserve currency for the dollar. As you know, that takes decades to build up trust and confidence. But one of the ways to do that would be to have a gold backing for the renminbi, the currency.
And at what point do they have enough gold to be able to do that? Is there, a specific number that we should be watching in terms of their gold reserves to understand when they have the ability to back their currency with gold?
There is. I have a very dear friend who's retired now from the Reserve Bank of South Africa, who years ago, when I asked him that question, told me what a kind of an historical guideline is. As I recall, I haven't looked at this. It's actually an interesting question you bring up. As I recall, it's around 10% of their total reserves to make it credible. But somewhere in that ballpark.
Okay.
William, what are the real motives? The amount of conflicts that we're seeing, that the United States is in some way behind, whether we're talking about the Arab Spring, whether we're talking about Egypt now, the Yemens, it just goes on and on. There's an increasing intensity. To me, is suggesting they're on a clock or time is running out, that there's a crisis that they know is coming. And John and I have talked extensively financially what that is, but I'm wondering from a geopolitical position you sense that.
Well, let's step back a little bit to better understand this, I think. Go back to 1945 after the U.S. dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, not to save American lives in a prolonged war with the Japanese. They had given up and the U.S. knew that. Truman knew that when he gave the order. But to signal to the world and to signal especially to the Soviet Union, to Stalin, that there's only one king on the hill, and that was the United States. And they would stop at nothing, including detonating this terrifying weapon of atomic warfare to underscore that at a time when they had the monopoly on nuclear weapons. Since that time, the U.S., now I'm not talking about the American people and the institutions of government and so forth that we read in the history books in high school or college or whatever. I'm talking about the reality of power in the United States. The power establishment circles who are in control of the interest groups. That's what you have to follow the money to understand how things work in this world, unfortunately. And if you look at the United States in terms of these interest groups, these lobbying groups, well, you have the power of Wall Street, which is the power of the money. You have the power of the military-industrial complex, something that Eisenhower warned about in his farewell speech in 1961. and it's more than abundantly become the reality today. And it's almost running on automatic pilot. It's become so immense with $1 trillion a year Pentagon budget and whatnot. But the agribusiness, these are the three of the, and with the military-industrial complex, big oil is an intimate part of that. It can't be separated. Halliburton is the best example of the hybridization of big oil and the gunboats that follow big oil around the world.
I would add to that the security surveillance complex, which has become absolutely massive.
Well, that is part of the Pentagon. So it's understood that that's of course part of it, the NSA and Cyber Command. But that really, in a sense, is not news. It's just some details are leaking out about the sophistication of some of the software. I suppose one of the effects of these leaks is to make us all tremble in our boots that we're helpless and powerless to do anything. But in any case, that is the case that they do have these data banks and surveillance possibilities. I've assumed that in my own work for about the last 20 years. But there are two pillars of power of this establishment. The used to be called the East Coast establishment. Now it's I would call it the Anglo-American establishment, and that is dominant force on the military level globally. The U.S. annual military budget exceeds the combined military budgets, I think, of the next 42 countries in the world together. One retired admiral said, "Who are we competing with, ourselves?" But that is the full spectrum dominance side of the thing. The other pillar of U.S. hegemony or U.S. power has been and remains the dollar as world reserve currency. If that were to go, and it threatened to go, this is the interesting thing on the euro crisis, it was threatening to go in 2009, 2010, and conveniently enough, Papandreou, a socialist prime minister who was just elected in Greece over a conservative government, announced that he had discovered shenanigans that the conservatives had used to qualify to join the euro in 2002. And so this big scandal broke out. Hedge funds began shorting European bonds and Greek bonds in particular, and the euro. And lo and behold, we had a euro crisis. The U.S. rating agencies, Bernanke of the Fed, the U.S. Treasury, the White House, everybody jumped in on the bandwagon. And that took the pressure off the dollar. So the dollar as reserve currency is absolutely crucial, because that means China, Japan in the 80s, China today ends up, like it or not, they have to invest their trade surpluses from their dollar trade surpluses on the world market in U.S. Treasuries. There's no other place big enough to absorb several hundreds of billion dollars per year that the Chinese central bank accumulates. So in effect, China is financing wars against Chinese national interest.
Just as a point here for some of our listeners that may not be aware, oil can only be bought in the world in U.S. dollars.
Yep.
And that goes back to an agreement back during Kissinger's point as Secretary of State with Saudi Arabia for an arms agreement when we had which was an orchestrated oil crisis here in America, in my humble opinion. And any time we've had an objection to that, like Saddam Hussein, who was removed about 90 days after because he wanted to trade it also in euros.
Well, he was doing it in euros with the French,
Yeah, we had it in Libya when Gaddafi was going to start in North Africa trading it for gold. And it was so anytime we've had anybody that was going to move from that, and by the way, Iran, it's my understanding, are putting in a bourse now to be able to trade it in other currencies. The United States has quickly retaliated. But the issue is, it's not about the oil. It's about the trade that goes on in the U.S. dollars. And therefore, without doing that, the U.S. dollar as a reserve status is in serious jeopardy, and it's already weakening because it's not as dominant from a trade standpoint as it used to be.
The Treasury has to fill the gap, and the Fed. Bernanke has to, $80 billion a month that they're buying of federal debt. So the right hand is washing the left hand. They're not able to get it from outside anymore.
Startling realization, I'm sure, to many of our listeners is the research that you've done on oil and the sources of oil. And in fact, it's not really, as we learn in school, a product of fossil compensation. Can you comment on that?
Sure. Well, I've developed a friendship with several of the leading scientists, geophysicists, geochemists, and geologists in the world who've developed this alternative theory. It came out of the Cold War when Stalin gave the command to the Academy of Sciences in the Soviet Union to make Russia. I don't care how you do it. You'll have the budget, whatever you need. Make the Soviet Union energy independent from the West because we have to have our national security of energy. And they began as real scientists. They began with a basic question. What is the genesis of hydrocarbon, oil, gas, coal? What is the genesis? And they studied all the standard American textbooks, all the British, European textbooks. And as they went in deeper and deeper, they began just laughing themselves sick. They said, there's no science in here. It's a religion that oil is a fossil fuel, that it comes from dead dinosaur detritus, that somehow, in some cases, the oil has been recovered at 25,000 feet under the earth. That's almost 5 miles by my rough calculation. How does these dead dinosaurs get down so deep? Then they said, well, where does it come from? And then they thought about the deep earth. They worked in the deep earth physics section of the Moscow State University, most of the research. And they came up first with a hypothesis in the 50s, and since then it's been absolutely demonstrated with repeat experiments with precision that it's the case that hydrocarbons are generated in the bowels of the earth in this gigantic fissile oven called the core of the earth, which is always burning. And the earth as a planet is microscopically expanding, like blowing up a balloon very, very slowly. And at the surface of the balloon, imagine 300 million years ago, you had what Alfred Wegener, the German scientist, called in 1914 the Pangea. You had the east coast of Brazil and the west coast of Africa fit together like hand and glove. They were one landmass. And then as the Earth expanded, you have this separation, and this tectonic separation, the so-called tectonic plates, which is really a very cheap way of describing what's going on. There's tremendous pressure and temperature driving these hydrocarbons, very simple gases, methane, from through the mantle, through fissures in the Earth's mantle, up toward the surface, 200 kilometers higher than the mantle, upper mantle, and it gets trapped in various rock formations, and then becomes oil fields like Gawar in Saudi Arabia, or various other fields, the Permian Basin in Texas and whatnot. And then if you know where these tectonic areas of activity are, you can find this oil. Well, Russia today is neck and neck with Saudi Arabia as the world's largest oil producer. And the interesting thing the Russians found out is it's always being created anew. So
So it's renewable.
Yeah, it's a renewable resource. They estimate 3,500 years minimal with the fields we have now, if we properly, if the rate of extraction is matched with the rate of refill.
That's a profound realization if it's true.
Well, you can imagine there's a lobby group that's trying every single thing in the book. I outline this in great detail in Myths, Lies, and Oil Wars, in my latest book, which is available in online in Amazon or in Kindle form. But I go into the Russian science on this and the ways by which the West has tried. Well, the big oil companies, Exxon and Shell and so forth, finance the peak oil movement through the back door. That'll give you an idea. This idea that the world is running out of oil and we have to start making candles for the caves and forget about all these wonderful.
Now, production is declining at a lot of big fields. Does that mean that extraction is exceeding the rate of new production? Basically,
and this has actually been demonstrated in Tatarstan in Russia, one of the oil provinces, which during the end of the Cold War, the Soviets ordered full max exploitation of all the oil fields because the price of oil had been deliberately collapsed by Bush Sr. and George Shultz and people in the Reagan administration in the 80s. partly to weaken the Soviet Union and rob them of hard currency, dollar currency, to compete with the Strategic Defense Initiative and the whole, military challenge of the U.S. So the Soviets simply extracted as fast as they could, and that led to an apparent depletion of these wells, and they shut them down. Now, Russian geophysicist friends of mine have gone back into these wells in Tatarstan and elsewhere, and lo and behold, those wells are stocked full again. And they've done chemical analyses, and the oil is new oil from deep in the earth.
So we could function with a petroleum-based economy at a lower level of consumption for as long as we wanted to then?
Well, we don't even need a lower level of consumption. We need to know where to look for it. And actually, big oil is finding oil everywhere it looks. They're running into oil instead of running out of it. And then they try to shut it down. Like in one of the interesting things about the Haiti earthquake several years ago, U.S. Obama ordered 20,000 troops, paratroopers and so, to go into Port-au-Prince immediately and barbed wire off a certain area. Well, that was the area where, owing to the earthquake, petroleum was seeping up onto the ground in visible quantities, and they wanted to make sure that that was not known. They didn't go there for humanitarian aid.
We are breaking this session at this point and will continue on the next tape number 2. We have a very large audio and iTunes listener base who have requested that the sessions be kept to approximately 20 minutes in duration. We'll be right back.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.